You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 4th of August 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wonders if there's anything to be said for another military escalation. Is the current threat of more sanctions against Russia going to have any greater impact than previous threats of more sanctions against Russia? And British Conservatives scream at each other about how wrong they are, which saves everyone else the trouble. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Marta Lorimer and Alex von Tunzelmann will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the author James Bloodworth about his new book Lost Boys, chronicling his journeys in the strange swamp known as the Manosphere. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Marta Lorimer, lecturer in politics at Cardiff University, and by Alex von Tunzelmann, historian, author and screenwriter. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Marta, alert listeners, or at least listeners with memories, may recall that I think last time you were here, you announced that you were about to swan off for an extended period in Italy. You have now swanned back. How was it?
Italy was wonderful as usual. I think I must have put on a few kilos, and by a few I mean about 5. But I have since been back. I've been on a writing retreat in the north of England, so I am ready to start thinking again.
How deep and profound was the contrast between whichever bit of Italy you were in and whichever bit of the north of England you were in? They're quite different places. I'm casting no shade on either. Very fond of both, just to be clear, especially to northern Englanders.
I had no water for about a week in Italy, as in there was no running water, whereas that was absolutely not a problem in northern England. There was water coming from every possible pore. Usually
the sky. Why was there no running water in Italy?
It's a long story that has got to do with EU funding having to be spent in time and companies doing all of the works that they really should have done in the previous year just now, leaving you without water in July.
Excellent. Well, we will be returning to the theme of nothing working in Italy later in the programme. Alex, sticking with the theme of writers' retreats, we would around this time allow you the opportunity to insufferably plug the one you hold, I think, circa November. But this year there's no point. There's no tickets left.
No, I'm afraid the Silk Road Slippers writing retreats in November. We've got Colin McCann and Nadifa Mohammed as our guests, and they're completely sold out.
For people who have missed out this year and may be thinking about next year, what does this broadly entail?
Well, it entails handing yourself over to a team of me, the legendary book editor Alexandra Pringle, who was editorial director of Bloomsbury for many years, and also to the snazzy editor Faiza Khan, and to this amazing guest author, whoever we put up. And next year we've got, for instance, Max Porter, Samantha Harvey, Maggie O'Farrell and Michelle Hussain all coming. And
I'm not busy circa next November.
Well, you are our backup, Andrew.
As far as I know.
And basically, yes, handing over
down.
your delicate writing to us so that we can, in USA Today last week, and they called us savage. So it can be quite an experience. But usually we're very kind.
I can tell other people they can't write. I'd do that for nothing. Next November.
Will there be running water is what I want to know.
Yes, it's in Morocco, which is very civilised and has excellent running water.
Well, we will start in Israel, where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continues to perform his impression of the proverbial man who only has a hammer and to whom the whole world therefore resembles a nail. He is reportedly pitching a military solution to free the last 20 or so of the living Israeli hostages seized by Hamas on October 7th, 2023, despite the pretty obvious fact that nearly 2 years of military operations have not as yet freed them. This comes as 600 600 or so former Israeli security officials, including former Israel Defense Force generals and heads of Mossad and Shin Bet, have signed an open letter to US President Donald Trump, pleading with him to lean on Netanyahu to call it all off. Marta, do we imagine that Benjamin Netanyahu genuinely has no better ideas, or is he merely pretending he has no better ideas?
I don't really know where he goes from here at this point. The fact that he's suggesting a new military solution leaves me completely puzzled as to what we have been observing for the last 2 years. So this simply suggests that if he's speaking of a new kind of military solution, it's probably that he's completely given up on the 20 hostages that are still there, and that he's just trying to find some way out. But is there really a way out for him at this point that doesn't involve probably stepping down?
Which he is, of course, not at all keen to do due to the severe domestic legal difficulties which may then beset him. Alex, what do you think? Is he just somebody at this point, and people have suggested it, that either cannot think of a way to end this war or will not think of a way to end this war?
Simple answer, yes. Yes, he's exactly that. I mean, I think, to be honest, there has been a pretty strong suggestion since quite early on, and, very much supported by the families and so on, that he's never had the hostages as a high priority in this campaign. And, I mean, that's been a fairly constant complaint. There have been lots of protests in Israel to that end, that he hasn't prioritised the hostages since the start. And I think what we're seeing now is indeed 2 years of not prioritising the hostages. Still, they are not prioritised. So the idea now, I mean, as Marta says, the idea that there will now be a military solution. Well, this has been a military campaign, and we still have, we believe, around 20 hostages in captivity, possibly the bodies of another 30 or so there. So it's it does feel, I'm afraid, rather like playing for time. It feels like there isn't really a way for him to move forward on that. And especially, as you say, at the same time as you've had, this really extraordinary letter from sort of 600 people of incredible seniority, many of them, saying, Trump, please save us from Netanyahu.
It is extraordinary, and I do want to come back to that. But Hamas's own statements, Marta, in the last 24 hours or so, they rather suggest that they are not an organisation with many better ideas either. They're now suggesting that maybe the Red Cross could send aid to the hostages who have been depicted over the weekend in fairly dreadful condition by Hamas's own photography. That doesn't sound like an organisation that's in any great hurry to let them go, because, again, for Hamas, the release of the hostages would force a conclusion to this war as well. And the post-war scenarios for Hamas do not look promising.
They don't look promising for anyone involved. And I suspect that is also one of the reasons why this conflict keeps dragging on, is because there still is no clear sense of a way out of the conflict and of what do you do next, in the same way that there never seems to have really been a particularly clear idea with what to do with it. But here you're coming out of a 2-year conflict, and no real solution appears to be in mind, and no sense of a durable settlement is really emerging. So we're starting to see some changes, even across the world, in terms of just European countries starting to speak about recognizing Palestine. But beyond that, we don't really know what happens.
Alex, there has been a lot of criticism of those moves by various countries, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, to either recognise Palestine or say we will when or if certain conditions are or are not met. There has been a response to Israel that this has merely emboldened Hamas. And is that necessarily wrong? Because Hamas, since those announcements have been made, have sounded a little more cocky. They're now saying they won't disarm until there's a Palestinian state, whereas I think most interlocutors, including as of last week the actual Arab League, have suggested that one condition for a Palestinian state is going to have to be Hamas disarming and giving up.
Yes, I mean, it does, I'm afraid at this point, to a lot of us, feel a little bit like angels dancing on the head of a pin as well, on the basis that there's, I know Israel is, of course, saying that there's no starvation in Gaza, but, international agencies are quite clearly reporting very widespread, very dangerous famine conditions in Gaza. And really at this point, it feels like a bit of a technicality as to whether or not there's a state recognition at precisely this point and what that means and who gets what. And all of this feels a bit like, could we just sort of not worry about this quite so much and actually just feed some people who are starving to death? I mean, it is, though, a very intractable situation, as Marta said, absolutely, that, this feels like one that nobody actually is getting any sort of outcome that they particularly want from. And meanwhile, the humanitarian result on the ground is absolutely horrific. And and there's no apparent interest in resolving that.
Well, let's talk a bit about this letter signed by more than 600 people. And to be very clear, these are absolutely not, Marta, a sort of coterie of sandal-wearing, scented candle-owning peacenik hippies. This is several former heads of Mossad, Shin Bet, several generals, people who have masterminded wars against Israel's enemies and served in those wars. One of them, Ami Ayalon, former head of Shin Bet, said this war started as a just war, defensive war, but once we achieved its military objectives, once we achieved a brilliant military victory against all our enemies, this war stopped being a just war. This is leading the state of Israel to the loss of its security and its identity. Is he wrong?
I don't think he's wrong, and I think we are seeing, whereas for the first year or year and a half, we hadn't really seen much resistance, I would say, from within Israel. Now we are starting to see this more and more obviously. And internationally, there's also been a bit of a turn in terms of how much the international community, I suppose, is willing to let Israel get away with. So I don't think they're necessarily wrong, and there does seem to be some increasing recognition that we've gone beyond anything that could be considered as a measured response.
I just want to come back finally to Ami Ayalon, sort of, because I did interview him for the Foreign Desk a couple of years ago, which I recommend to listeners. Also his book Friendly Fire, about subtitle How Israel Became Its Own Worst Enemy, and that came out a few years ago. His line, Alex, was always that Israel should look at a two-state solution not as some sort of great charitable good and a wonderful thing for us to do, but because that is in itself the best guarantor of Israel's security. I mean, I know his views have hardened somewhat since October 2023, but that fundamental precept, does that still strike you as the logical thing to hold on to? Well,
I think that's a point of view that an awful lot of Israelis have themselves put over the years. I remember hearing a talk by Aleph Bet Yehoshua, a great Israeli writer, where it was in London, where he also exhorted British Jews who were more liberal to move to Israel to make Aliyah, because he said, and this was several years ago, he's been dead for several years, he said, we're failing and this is going in a terrible direction, and we need people to come who are more reasonable to balance this out and actually run this state very differently. And I think a lot of people have, long thought exactly that actually a two-state solution is potentially in Israel's interests, because what it does is preserve actually Israel's existence and defend it actually in a way. However, I don't even know really where we are in terms of that discussion. As you say, I think international opinion has shifted actually tremendously. I would say, I think there was, after the 7th of October and the awful scenes that we saw then, I think there was actually a considerable sympathy for Israel at that point. And I do think at this point, kind of 2 years on from that nearly, I think that situation has reversed really. And now I think there is, clearly a very, very different situation internationally. And I think it could well be said, I don't think, who wants to analyse Netanyahu's behaviour? As you say, a lot of his behaviour is quite clearly driven by his own domestic political woes. But I think there's a pretty good argument for saying he has not been acting actually in Israel's best interests at all.
Well, to Moscow now, which is the journey that Steve Witkoff, American property developer turned US diplomatic envoy for some reason, will be making again later this week. Witkoff is scheduled to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday, apparently to see if some sort of terms can be come to over Ukraine before further US sanctions against Russia kick in on Friday, including secondary sanctions, i.e. punitive tariffs on countries which continue to import Russian oil and gas, a list which very much includes China and India. Somewhat confusingly, also the EU. President Putin's level of interest in a ceasefire can perhaps be gauged by the fact that this recently elapsed July was the worst month yet for air raids on Ukraine, with nearly 6,300 long-range drone attacks recorded. Marta, do you expect peace to descend by the end of the week?
I feel that every time that I'm here and we talk about Russia, I say some variation of, I do not think that Putin has any interest in a truce, in a ceasefire, in anything at all. I might be wrong, but my understanding of Putin is that what he's interested in is essentially power and keeping it. Mm-hmm. And the way he's going to keep it is by keeping this war going for as long as he can. There is, to me, no respectable out for him at this stage, and probably not in the near future.
Alex, are sanctions going to work this time? Or perhaps I should phrase that another way. If sanctions were going to work, wouldn't they have worked by now?
Yes, and they don't. Generally speaking, we see a pretty low hit rate for sanctions, generally as a sort of political tool, to be honest with you. But certainly, I think in the case of looking at Russia specifically at the moment and Putin, I think the feeling of being embattled, as so often is the case actually with sanctions, tends to shore up that sort of regime really, rather than bring it down, because then you can obviously sell a pretty easy angle on the world's against us and therefore we must draw together and be strong. I'm afraid, sorry to just repeat Marta, but I tend to agree that I think if Putin had any interest in a ceasefire or in any kind of end to this war, I don't see why he wouldn't already have been negotiating and, to that end. I think the only person who's really surprised by that appears to be Donald Trump.
In increasing desperation then, Marta, is there any possibility at all that these so-called secondary sanctions, if enforced against China and India in particular, might serve to prize them off Russia, or have they both picked a team here?
I think they've both picked a team. I don't think these sanctions are going to really change that much for them. I think Alex made this point quite rightly. Sanctions don't really work. Or they're a tool, they're probably one of the best tools that we have, but they don't necessarily work as well as we would like them to.
Well, just finally on this then, Alex, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev last week, and not for the first time, demonstrated that vodka and social media don't necessarily mix all that well, in response to which President Trump announced that he was going to reposition 2 nuclear submarines, higher class submarines, closer to Russia. That, to be clear, that's not all that interesting in itself, is it? Because nuclear submarines get moved into position all the time. That's basically the point of them. But is there at least anything significant to the fact that Trump said it out loud by way of reminding the Russians that they're there?
I mean, maybe, but I think when you're generally trying to interpret sort of Trump's output at the moment, it's a little bit of sort of clairvoyance going on, because he's got pretty erratic in terms of what he says as well, rather than thinking it's particularly laser guided. I mean, yes, he sent Steve Witkoff to negotiate this, who, as you say, was a real estate lawyer, really, someone who Trump likes because he's good at deals, he thinks, which of course is the thing Trump wants. He says, Putin's got to make a deal and all of this. But I mean, Witkoff has no diplomatic experience before 2025 and is, somebody who kind of, and maybe that helps not to understand all the background that we're bold, weighed down with all the time. Perhaps it helps to be completely free of it. But I think Putin is somebody who very much knows what he wants, and for, again, sort of very existential reasons of his own survival, really, and trying to persuade him out of that for reasons that might be convenient to Trump seems to me highly unlikely.
Well, to the United Kingdom now, which has once again been delighted by the opinions of its most former of former Prime Ministers. Liz Truss, who listeners may recall inhabiting 10 Downing Street for 7 inexplicable weeks in 2022 before being summarily defenestrated by her own exasperated party. Gloriously, Truss believes herself in possession of wisdom which might benefit the current leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, who does, in fairness, seem on course to be Prime Minister for 7 weeks less than Liz Truss was. Truss in another editorial blaming everyone but herself for her own failings, accused Badenoch of being beholden to, quote, spurious narratives. Alex, imagine that. How much do you enjoy hearing from Liz Truss?
I don't know why we're still hearing anything from Liz Truss. I mean, a period of silence would be most welcome, I would suggest, on behalf of Liz Truss, who, as you say, sort of has accepted none of what quite clearly were her own failings that everybody else seems to think were. And in fact, quite often, maybe I shouldn't say it, because quite often she seems to threaten to sue people who suggest she's responsible for her own failings.
I would pay good money to watch that court case.
I mean, she keeps sort of trying it, but I mean, really, she's not even an MP. I mean, she's a complete irrelevance at this point. She lost her seat at the last election.
She did.
I mean, she has absolutely nothing to offer in terms of insight in the current situation. I mean, believe me, it takes quite a lot for me to sit here defending Kemi Badenoch, who I think is doing a pretty hopeless job as leader of Britain's Conservatives. But, I mean, for goodness sake, if there's one person who could do it worse, I think we have a prime example.
I mean, Marta, it is, of course, not unusual for a party which has been spanked at the polls, as the Tories were about a year ago, to embark on a period of sort of, shin kicking and hair pulling and just general internecine squabbling afterwards. So this may just be that. But does it seem weird that that's happening here, where elsewhere in Europe, Conservative parties, for better or for worse, do appear to be getting somewhat more organised?
Well, have you heard about France lately? No,
I lent heavily on somewhat there.
Somewhat. No, I think there's a broader problem that the right, and by this I mean the traditional mainstream centre, right, is facing around Europe. And that is that they are increasingly competing with far-right parties that are becoming themselves better organised and more successful. And the centre-right doesn't really know what to do with that. The strategy that they seem to have more or less collectively agreed upon is to say, well, look, the radical right is successful. How about we copy them, but tell people that we're going to be much better at doing what they say they're going to do because we have experience with government. And this is a strategy that isn't really working for them. And it's precisely the problem that the Conservative Party is facing right now, where they have to pay for the years of government that people still remember. I mean, my favourite thing about Kemi Badenoch is that she's trying to say that Liz Truss was not one of them. The way she's presenting it, it's like she's saying she was not a real Conservative. And they have reform on the side, and they're trying to think about, okay, how do we keep our voters? And instead of thinking, well, there's a bunch of people that are going to go to the Lib Dems. There's a bunch of people who have left us for Labour but might be willing to come back. Surely there's even a couple of defectors to the Greens. They're saying we're going to go into reform territory. And at that point, you have made yourself completely irrelevant because there's no difference between you and reform.
Well, on that thought, Alex, reform, according to most polling, are currently leading as Britain's preferred party, for all the fact that they currently have, I think, 4 MPs, and that, to be clear, given the current rate of attrition, is very much as of this broadcast. A lot of the councillors who were elected, or at least a dozen of the councillors who were elected under the reform ticket earlier this year, have resigned in circumstances of assorted murkiness. We are now 4 years, thereabouts, away from the next general election in the United Kingdom. How much further into that period should the mainstream parties get before they start panicking at the prospect of Nigel Farage Prime Minister?
Well, I don't think they should panic, but I think they should really pay attention to it from right now. And I mean, actually, the problem, particularly in Britain, seems to be that, I mean, Marta has absolutely described what the Conservatives are doing, which is saying, reform are wrong about everything, but we're exactly like them, so vote for us. Unfortunately, the Labour Party in government also seem to be saying that. They seem to be saying, well, Nigel Farage is obviously right about migration and immigration and all of this, but don't listen to him. Vote for us. We won't do anything about it either. I mean, this is just not appealing. And everybody seems to be chasing this same kind of 30% of voters that vote for reform, while ignoring the fact that 70% of people seem to have no intention of doing that and actually want a different offering. And it's a sort of bizarre spectacle. Actually, Britain isn't a particularly far-right country by a lot of European standards, and yet there's sort of completely disproportionate press attention and constant chasing and political attention on a sort of handful of, pretty embittered far-right voters is, just seems...
Certainly they get far more attention than the people who elected 72 Liberal Democrat MPs.
Well, quite, who perhaps deserve some attention. I mean, admittedly, if you elect a Liberal Democrat, you aren't expecting a lot of attention, really. I mean,
indeed not.
But I mean, there seems to be very little offering, actually, for people who are, and I mean, absolutely, as Marta says, sort of the traditional centre-right, but also really the centre-left seems to have been largely abandoned.
There is that. But can we rely, or can we possibly complacently rely, Marta, and I'm aware as I say this that the American experience would appear to suggest not, that far right and indeed far left parties, because this I think affects parties at both edges of the spectrum, tend to contain the seeds of their own eventual downfall and destruction because they are frankly disproportionately riddled with lunatics?
Well, it used to be the case. What we know from research is that these parties are getting much better at organising. They still struggle. Again, in places like France, there's been a big problem with their regional councillors that sort of get elected and then they're kicked out of the party because, they had a swastika tattoo. Happens to the best of us. So they still struggle with some organisational things, but they are becoming more well organised, and one of the reasons this is working for them is precisely because they're electorally successful. So they are able to attract the kind of people who actually have political ambition in a way that they weren't able to do before. So they're getting more savvy candidates, and I think that in that way they don't necessarily contain the seeds of their own destruction, because there'll still be some lunatics within these parties, but they're increasingly building a political class that is actually quite savvy and that is, going to keep them going for a while.
Just as a final thought on this, Alex, does that therefore suggest that the centre-right, centre-left and indeed centre parties should be a bit more robust in, I guess, calling that out rather than attempting to lean into or appropriate it? I mean, I do kind of think one of those forks in the road in British history is that you can remember David Cameron as Tory Prime Minister dismissing the then UKIP as a load of fruitcakes, loonies and racists. And I do wonder if he just held that line, how different things might now be.
Yes, I mean, he wasn't wrong. And I think it might have been a good idea to stick to it. Yes, I mean, once again, a very short answer, yes. I do think that actually there needs to be some, rather than kind of just say constantly chasing this 30% of elusive voters. And it seems to, I don't know why there's something so sort of self-hating in the Labour Party as well that appears to propel them towards this, when they have plenty of perfectly good voters who don't want any of that, who they could be appealing to. It seems deeply weird to me, and I do think that actually, as we sort of have said, I think you can see why the Conservative Party is rather in the weeds after the last election, and most parties at that point do need to sort of have a little bit of a fight and pick themselves up. I'm not sure Labour in government has any such excuse.
Well, to Italy now, and a proposal from the What Could Possibly Go Wrong school, i.e. a plan to address the inefficiency of various arms of Italian bureaucracy by establishing a new arm of Italian bureaucracy. The idea is that this would address the shocking debts being racked up by many Italian cities by recovering unpaid local taxes and traffic fines incurred but never coughed up by delinquent scofflaws. Listeners absolutely cannot imagine how difficult it has been to write an introduction to this topic without invoking the debt-collecting talents of certain elements of Italy's business world. Marta, I feel I owe you right of reply. Is this, assuming we can't just dangle people by their ankles out of hotel bedroom windows or leave horses' heads in their beds to get their traffic fines paid, is this necessarily a bad idea?
I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea, but
it just won't work.
There's a reason why this debt hasn't been collected, and presumably it's because people don't want to pay, because they're dead, because you can't locate them. There's a bunch of reasons. So I'm not sure how establishing an agency is really, or, getting the agency that already does this stuff to actually help you is really going to help. And besides, probably Italy has bigger issues. There's more money that could come in from proper tax evasion. Rather than from you were fined for accidentally driving down a bus lane.
Nevertheless, these sums are not inconsequential, Alex. They think that various Italian cities are owed 25 billion euros in unpaid taxes, fines and fees, although due to people dying, paperwork getting lost, etc., only 6 billion of that may now be recoverable. Is this one of those things where, because I know that there's a temptation and a tendency indeed in some quarters to just write stuff off because the amounts involved actually are worth less than what the expense that would be incurred in actually chasing them up. But is there an argument for chasing them up nonetheless? Does it not state, look, everybody has to contribute, there is a law?
Yes, I mean, 25 billion down to 6 billion recoverable is a pretty leaky bucket, isn't it? I mean, you'd be pretty miserable if you lost that much. Yes, there is an argument that you need to do something to change the culture of this, and that does involve actually a bit of enforcement of what's already happened. It's really difficult to do, though. I mean, I think that achieving that sort of cultural change is huge. There were some points have been put forward. I think some Italian cities, for instance, have created an app. I mean, the answer to everything, of course, in the modern world, to make it easier for people to pay, which is a lovely euphemism. Easier to track, shall we say, whether people owe things. If you've digitised the records and so forth, then perhaps you can do that. Maybe some cities will do better at kind of keeping the records for this sort of stuff and for enforcing them in a timely fashion, because, as you say, when people have died and so forth, often that is just because there are huge delays in trying to collect any of this money. And, it was 40 years ago, nobody can remember what happened, and so everyone's now dead. I mean, so, there's a sort of cultural change that you could perhaps start nudging by this sort of thing, and by kind of trying to collect some of these older debts, and by sort of, changing the methods by which you approach and collect it in the future. But I do think it's very, very hard to achieve, especially when there clearly has been this very long legacy of non-enforcement.
Just finally on this, Marta, do we like the idea of the city of Turin, who are getting a bit medieval on delinquent businesses? The idea is now that if you end up owing the city more than 50,000 euros, they just pull your plugs. You're out of business. They revoke your licences.
That's pretty hardcore. Do they then give you a chance to pay the money back?
I am not entirely sure. I assume so.
I would guess that in that case it seems fair. You should pay your taxes. So why not?
Because the thing I like that about, Alex, is that it's simple, and I speak, and you may be in the same boat as a fellow freelancer, somebody who has just written their twice yearly cheque to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, having almost no comprehension whatsoever of how that figure was arrived at or what it will be spent on.
Yes, baffling. Yes, I completely agree. And accountancy software has made that no clearer. None. It's absolutely impossible, really, to work out as a normal human. Yes, and I do think, actually, Turin's attitude there seems to me, with the proviso that indeed this fine can then be paid and the thing can be plugged back in again, I'm afraid I agree. I think that seems rather sensible, really. Seems quite straightforward to understand that if you don't pay your taxes, there are consequences, I think is kind of the base level to establishing a system that actually is enforceable.
Well, we fixed Italy. Alex von Tunzelmann and Marta Lorimer, thanks both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, a great deal of angst is at large over upcoming generations of young men, bewildering quantities of whom are relying for life guidance on such preposterous creatures as Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, and other denizens of the subculture which has become known as the manosphere. James Bloodworth's new book, Lost Boys, A Personal Journey Through the Manosphere, is a collection of dispatches from this realm, lent additional authority by the fact that Bloodworth, by his own admission, once took a few steps towards membership of the manosphere before thinking better of it. I spoke to James earlier and began by asking what had briefly attracted him.
Yeah, so in 2005, I was looking on the internet. Had been through a long period. I was quite young and shy and socially awkward. And I was in college at the time. There was a young woman I was interested in, but I was just kind of clueless. Like, how do I ask?
This is a tale as old as time.
Yes, it is. And then I went home one day after college and Googled how to ask a girl out. And I discovered this forum, and it was kind of men sharing. I kind of didn't really know what to think, first of all, but kind of worth a try, worth reading, see what they're saying. And it was it turned out to be a pickup artist forum, which would become famous that year through a book by Neil Strauss.
This is The Game by Neil Strauss.
Yeah, kind of undercover, looking at this subculture of men who gathered on online forums. to kind of share some of it relatively benign, like tips on how to kind of grooming tips, or, you know, what aftershave to wear, or how to approach someone you like in a bar. But then there was also kind of this whole systematic idea of gender relations. So they thought they believed they had gender relations to like this exact science.
I mean, some of it is, as you say, harmless. The idea of teaching people how to start a conversation or open themselves up a bit or overcome shyness. But it's kind of the gateway drug, I guess. And this is what I think makes your book more interesting than most studies of this sphere, in that you get to a certain point in the manosphere and then sort of realise, actually, a lot of these people are just awful and I don't really want anything to do with it. Whereas, of course, a lot of people do keep going, and that's where they end up becoming acolytes of the likes of Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, and similar weirdos. When you think back on the period, was there a particular moment for you where you thought personally, I'm not enjoying this and I'm not happy about it and I'm not comfortable with it?
I mean, the reason I became interested in that stuff initially was because basically I wanted to have a girlfriend. It was just like, oh, how do I...
A reasonable ambition.
Yeah, like kind of, there was a lot of men in the community who kind of were in the manosphere at that time. It was just like, how do I get a girlfriend? Often men who had worked in engineering jobs, kind of socially awkward, and they tended to see social interaction through a problem-solving context. But then the longer you spent in the culture, the more you'd kind of become marinated in this view of men and women, which was very, very objectifying about women, obviously, but also very essentialist. So men and women were kind of depicted as caricatures. And I think for me, when I kind of thought, like, you know, I don't really need this, it was too elaborate and too kind of dehumanizing. So I didn't really want to, you know, it was cool to just learn a few kind of openers for when you go out or something, just conversations, basic conversation starters. I didn't see any harm with that. But there was also, it was all kind of marinated in this idea that it was just this positivistic science that you can just break down interactions with human beings, and then you start to lose the humanity in the other person, that they're just as variable. If you say certain things, they'll respond a certain way. And just kind of the language, the kind of the day-to-day language people would use about women, basically, in the subculture, was kind of off-putting. As someone who was mainly brought up by women, it kind of jarred the way they would casually talk about women.
I mean, that's possibly what saved you, because the thing that strikes me from not only reading your book about the people who get properly hardcore about this, but just my own encounters with the subculture online, the thing that always strikes me, and I'd be interested in your views on this, that for all that they are impelled by a desire for women, they don't actually seem to like women very much.
No, and often, so there would be a mixture of people who kind of fell into the manosphere, so to speak, or fell into the pickup community then, and some of those people were kind of regular guys in some ways. But then you did meet other people who kind of, it wasn't really about the women in the end. It was about women as kind of a trophy to show off to their friends, and women as a kind of reward object for a correct performance of masculinity or whatever. Women were kind of status objects, like a sports car or money or something. That was something I definitely noticed. And the longer people spent in the community as well, the more they were around this kind of objectifying these attitudes, you know, rating women on a scale of 1 to 10 and seeing women as just kind of these objects to be manipulated. I mean, someone could be a misogynist, or at least overlook the misogyny when they found the community, but the community would very often make men worse misogynists.
I think another thing that baffles the outsider, and it certainly baffles me, is that when you look at the kingpins of this movement you investigated, and it is people like Jordan Peterson, people like Andrew Tate, they just come across as just such obviously preposterous figures. What did you glean about what their appeal is? What makes people look at somebody like either of them and think, yes, that's what I want to be like?
I mean, it's partly social media. So the one thing that's changed in recent years is when I was younger, there were no algorithms. So I could kind of leave the community behind, and my YouTube algorithm or whatever wouldn't be pushing more radical videos onto me. And the other thing that social media has allowed is, or changed at least, in the past, people like Andrew Tate, kind of confidence men, may have, you know, put out an ad in the back page of a kind of top shelf magazine or something, or Men's Magazine or something like that, promising these kind of get-rich-quick schemes or these life coaching or whatever. But social media apps like Instagram, video-based, picture-based social media apps, they allow these charismatic influencers to present a lifestyle as well as the personality as well, so kind of telegenic charisma of someone like Andrew Tate or even Jordan Peterson. But they can also show off a lifestyle like fast cars, big houses, private jets, exotic travel, nice food, and also being around lots of glamorous women all the time, and these kind of status objects. And for teenage boys, that can be very alluring, that kind of thing. You tend to grow out of seeing those things as necessarily the be-all and end-all of life. But when I was younger, that wasn't really there either. So now they can these kind of personalities can communicate directly with a young person and also broadcast a lifestyle. And of course, what they don't tell people is that the lifestyle is often funded by the subscriptions of people who pay for these courses.
That was James Bloodworth speaking to me earlier. James's new book, Lost Boys, A Personal Journey Through the Manosphere, is available now. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Alex von Tunzelmann and Marta Lorimer. Today's show was produced by Carlotta Rebello and researched by Henry King. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.